Hello, folks. Thank you so much for joining us today. As you're entering into this webinar, if you'd like, please feel free to tell us where you're joining us from by entering your name and your location in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. Hello, Chris. Thank you for joining us from Los Angeles. Jennifer, thank you for joining us from Ohio. We have Pam joining us from Canada. Thank you for joining us, Pam. And Audrey from Toronto. Marilyn in Phoenix, thank you for joining us. Susanna from California. Oh, we have Carol, who's currently traveling. Wonderful. Jody, thank you for joining us from Pennsylvania. And to those of you on Facebook, thank you for joining us as well. And if you'd like, you can feel free to put your name and where you're joining us from in the comment section on Facebook. Oh, Hilda is joining us from Greece. And we have Garnet from Saskatchewan. Thank you for joining us, Garnet. Linda in Saratoga Springs, beautiful spot. Hello, Christopher. And Barb, hello to you in Alberta. All right, folks, thank you so much for joining us today for our World War History Tours Travel Talk series. This is our segment that we're doing on trends and tips. A few housekeeping items before we begin today. We want to remind you that on this webinar, we can't see or hear you, but you will be able to see me and our guests. But we do want to hear from you. So if you're joining us on Zoom and you have questions, please put them in the question and answer section at the bottom of your screen. And if you're joining us on Facebook, you can also put the questions into the comment section on Facebook. We want to thank you again for joining us for this session as we spotlight our World War history tours. As you know, in the US, we just observed Memorial Day, and we will shortly be marking the anniversary of the Allied forces landing at Normandy. We felt that this time was a special opportunity for us to share some information about this very important part of our tours portfolio. As we trace the history of these conflicts, our travelers will come to a deeper understanding of these important events and how they shape the world we live in today. Beyond that, however, these tours can serve a deep personal purpose. Many of our travelers join these tours to walk in the footsteps of a family member, and others will do so as a way to bear witness to the sacrifice that strangers made on their behalf decades ago. Whatever your reason for selecting one of these tours, our goal is to give you a deeper understanding of these events and how these brave people's actions reverberate through the years to the present. Today, we will share with you some information that will help you to choose the right itinerary for you as you explore this history. And we will also take some time to talk with our tour directors about these events, which our travelers have such great interest in. With that, let's outline our agenda for today. So first, we're going to start by talking with a member of our market and innovation development team about what are our history tours and how do they differ from some other offerings that you might find out there. Then we're going to go through talking with one of our tour directors about the experience in Normandy and exploring some of the history that you will see when you're on tour there. Then we will bring in another one of our tour directors to talk about Vimy Ridge and her experience going to the special event 100th anniversary commemoration there. And we are getting ready to mark 105 years since the Battle of Vimy Ridge, and we'll have special event tours there next year. So we're going to talk a bit about that. Then we'll touch on a few different itineraries that you can choose from our Go Ahead History Tours. And as I said, if you have questions, please submit them to the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen if you're on Zoom, or if you're on Facebook, you can put them into the comment section there. We'll try to either get to those questions during the course of our event today or at the end during the question and answer section. Now, before we begin, let's talk briefly about the Go Ahead difference and what sets our tours apart. Here at Go Ahead, we believe that the best way to learn about the world is to experience it, and we want to help you to do just that. So we take care of all of the little details for you and ensuring that as travel is opening back up, and it is, we have people on the road right now, that everything is arranged for you so you can have an incredible and safe experience. Between the hand-picked hotels and meals, the on-tour transportation, and personalized flight itineraries to get you to your trip, Go Ahead cultivates unique and unforgettable experiences for our travelers. Now, what really brings our tours to life, though, is our expert tour directors. Their passion and love for the countries we visit bring the experience to life, and today we are lucky to be joined by two of them, as well as a member of our market innovation and development team. So I would like to introduce them to you now. First, I would like to introduce you to Kevin Toomey. Kevin is the Associate Director of Market Innovation and Development for Go Ahead. Kevin, if you could come off of mute and tell us, introduce yourself, say hello, and also if you could tell us a little bit about your position at Go Ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm excited to be a part of this webinar. I work on the Market Innovation and Development team out of our Boston office. My role is to oversee all of our customized departures, and we'll talk a little bit about the options that you have to customize it for with Go Ahead later. I also work on designing many of our tours, including a special focus on our history tours, which are near and dear to my heart as a history buff myself.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kevin. And I'll be asking you a few questions in just a moment. So sit tight and I'll come back to you in just a moment. Next, we are joined by Ione Kerr. She is a tour director of ours, and she will be telling us about the experience of visiting a lot of the sites that are important to our Canadian travelers, including Vimy Ridge. Ione, could you tell us a bit about your experience working with Go Ahead, including how long you've been leading tours for us? Oh, Ione, you're muted.
Right,
There you
there
go.
I am. Sorry about that. I've been leading tours for Go Ahead for the last 8 years, and I lead tours mainly in Italy, but also in the Netherlands and Belgium and France, where I've lived for some years before.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm excited to talk to you about some of the sites that are on our tours. And David, if you could say hello and tell us a little bit about your history working with EF, and go ahead.
Hi everyone, it's a pleasure to be here. I've actually been a tour director with EF since 1989 and leading tours with Go Ahead since the mid-90s. I mainly do tours of Italy and then these specialized First and Second World War tours.
Wonderful. All right. Well, for now, what we're going to do is I'm going to talk to Kevin a little bit about our history tours, and then we're going to talk about Normandy and Vimy Ridge. But Kevin, first things first, I would love to talk to you about what makes our history tours so special. Can you tell us about the different types of tours that our travelers can choose to help them experience World War history?
Absolutely. So first off, we have our classic tours. Typically, these provide a combination of World War history with other immersive experiences in that destination. So just as one small example, in Normandy, you will spend a day touring the sites of the D-Day landing with your expert tour director leading the way. But you'll also stop at a local winery to taste Calvados, which is a distinct regional brandy from Normandy. So that's just one small example of how we kind of combine the historical focus with other types of experiences that are specific to that region. We also have our customized tours. So with customized, you can really make the experience completely your own. Just a group of 7 or more travelers can customize a trip with Go Ahead. I'll talk more about specific examples of custom World War history tours later, but really the sky is the limit in terms of the personalization that you can have on those custom tours. And then finally, we have our special event tours. These range from huge global commemorations that we've done in the past to more, intimate, smaller local celebrations. I would say the most exciting have been our tours that have exclusive access to the anniversaries at Normandy for D-Day, as well as at Vimy Ridge. So we have done the 75th anniversary of D-Day landings recently, the 100th anniversary of Vimy Ridge. These are events that typically only include heads of state, veterans, family of veterans, but as a part of EF, we are able to get select access, which is really
Wonderful. Well, thank you for telling us about those three different types of trips, Kevin. Another thing I was hoping that you could talk to us about was, can you tell us what sets our history tours apart from our other trips, but also compared to if you were to try and plan a trip like this on your own?
Yeah, absolutely. So first off is the tour director. We make sure to select tour directors with deep historic knowledge and a passion for bringing these places to life. You're meeting two of them today, but we really do have so many tour directors that have that history passion with us at EF, and we always make sure to have one of those tour directors leading any of our history tours.
And can you talk a little bit about some of the different types of experiences that we have cultivated on our World War history tours?
Yeah, absolutely. So we like to differentiate the experiences throughout the tour. So for example, many of our history tours will have history-focused sightseeings of major cities like London and Paris. So in London, we visit the Imperial War Museum and the Churchill War Rooms on our history-focused tour, with a local guide leading the way who's really kind of giving you the context for those amazing sites. The Churchill War Rooms are a personal favorite of mine. You really feel like you're stepping back in time when visiting the museum. On many other tours, we also cross the English Channel by ferry, stopping at the Dover Cliffs. So today it's just a ferry ride, but just the act of crossing the channel like this, I think, really puts you in the position of the brave soldiers who traveled across those same waters to liberate France many years ago. So it's just a sense of having that kind of living history during that transfer.
Yeah, I can imagine that would be a pretty incredible experience.
It is, yeah. And then finally, I mentioned Paris. So we do have a special history tour of Paris that focuses on the French resistance. So you'll stop at major sites like the Eiffel Tower, but overall the history is on, the focus is on World War history in France, and you'll hear commentary from your expert guide as you walk past places like the former Nazi headquarters and the city's memorial to martyrs of the French resistance.
Wow. Wow. Well, Kevin, one thing that I also wanted to, or I was hoping you would touch on is one of the things that I love about group travel is that I get to meet people that have, varying interests and we get to know each other and you get to learn things. But can you talk about what a special experience it is to travel on a tour where most folks are drawn to that itinerary by a common interest?
Absolutely. I think on all go-ahead tours I've been on, the group really gels and tends to get to know one another, but it can take some time for people to introduce themselves and find those common interests. And it's just really great traveling on a tour like this, where you have that shared connection from the get-go. So really from that first welcome dinner onward, people tend to be, sharing their own experiences, whether that is having friends or family members who have served in these war befores and the type of connection that brings. It could be, books that you've read that really teach you about the destination, or even museums in the U.S. or in Canada that you visited. Bring that history to life closer to home. So just being able to kind of share those recommendations with your fellow travelers from the get-go really makes for a nice atmosphere of the tour.
All right. And before I let you go, I want to ask you one more question. And I also have a question from a member of our audience that I'll put to you once you've gone through the next slide. But can you tell us a little bit about the different countries that our history tours tend to visit?
Yeah, absolutely. So Today we are focusing on France. We'll have David talking about our tours in Normandy and Ione talking about the Vimy region. But our history tours really go throughout Western Europe. So we have tours that travel into Berlin and Munich in Germany, tours throughout Belgium, focusing on some sites known for the Battle of the Bulge there. I mentioned a lot of our tours will start in London to do that English Channel crossing. And then finally, we have many tours throughout the Netherlands focusing on World War history, visiting places like the Anne Frank House and other sites along the way that were liberated by the Allied forces.
So Kevin, we got a question, and I imagine this might be something that you would talk about later in the presentation, but we got a question from Sharon on Facebook who asked if we have any World War II tours in the Pacific.
Great question. We do not at this time. However, as I mentioned, the sky really is the limit with Customize. So it's not just that we can customize tours that you would see in your catalog. We can really work with you on any type of trip that you would dream up. So if you do have a group of 7 or more travelers together, we could put together something custom for you that would visit the sites in the Pacific.
Great. And just a reminder for our audience, Kevin will be coming back to chat with us briefly at the end of the presentation about customized tours. So if you do have more questions about that, you can submit them to us. But for Sharon, the short answer to your question is yes, we can customize a tour for you if you'd like. And there are a lot of great historical sites that you could visit associated with World War II in the Pacific. At this time, I would like to transition into the next phase of our presentation. We are going to bring in David to talk about Normandy. So David, thank you so much again for joining us. And I know that you've led a number of our groups to Normandy in the past. And the first question I want to ask you is just what is it like to lead a group that is visiting those beaches for the first time?
To be honest, it's a very moving experience, especially if there are travelers that have direct connection, family members that fought there, which is quite often the case. It can bring up some very strong emotions. For me, of all of the tours I ever do, the Normandy ones, the other World War tours that I do, are probably the most emotional for me as well, even as a tour director. So I've always found it a very rewarding experience leading these tours.
Wow. Yeah, and I can imagine, especially if you have folks that have family connections to the folks that served there, that must be a really moving experience. And for today, we do want to talk about what it's like to visit there now, but I also think it's important that we do talk a bit about why these sites are so important. And so I was hoping that you could share some of your expertise with us and talk about the experience that American troops would have had landing on Normandy Beach and why this was such a pivotal place.
Yeah, well, here we can actually see Omaha Beach, one of the 2 American beaches. This was the beach where the untried 29th Infantry Division, the 5th Battalion of Rangers, part of the 2nd Rangers Battalion, and also then the battle-hardened 1st Division, who had seen action previously in North Africa and Italy. Because of really an insufficient naval bombardment before the landings, all of the German emplacements were intact, and they were very, very close to the sea itself. And so with the troops landing there, in some cases having to wade through neck-high water up to 200 yards just to physically get onto the beach under very, very heavy fire. This is why we see the highest casualties that the Allies suffered during the D-Day. In some cases, over 50% casualty rates of this first wave of troops landing on the beach. Because of this, even in the subsequent second wave of landings, had extremely high casualty rates, higher casualty rates than we see on the other 4 Normandy beaches. And so that's why we very much focus on these American tours with Omaha itself. When we visit Omaha, we actually walk to the main Omaha Memorial, but there are a number of other that we can see there. There are a number of other memorials just nearby, including memorial to the 29th Infantry Division, to the 5th Ranger Battalion, and one actually to the 2nd Infantry Division, which landed on D-Day +1, which obviously, if you have a special interest or a direct family connection, tour director will help you so that you'll be able to go and see those memorials. But also you'll have time then to, to stroll along the beach to reflect on the landings.
Now, there is a site that we always visit on our tours that that I was hoping you could talk about, just because the story here is so incredible, and that's Pont du Hoc. Can you talk about that? And also, as we transition to the next slide, can you tell us what we're looking at here as far as the landscape?
In fact, actually, what you can see in this photograph obviously was not taken that many years ago, but the pitted surface which has just been left. So these are all from the bombardment of the Allies on June the 6th, 1944. It maybe doesn't give a true impression of just how difficult this part of the operation was. Which is considered by a lot of people to be probably the single most impressive action by the Allied forces on D-Day. And in fact, to give you a quote from General Omar Bradley in his memoirs, A Soldier's Story, he actually wrote, "No soldier in my command has ever been wished a more difficult task than that which befell the 34-year-old commander of this provisional ranger force." Because the Rangers, led by Lieutenant Colonel James E. Rudder, had the objective of going up a sheer cliff, approximately 100 feet, from a small beach underneath the cliff, to capture and destroy a German emplacement where there was 6 heavy guns, 155mm guns, which could reach both to Utah and to Omaha beaches. Because of navigational problems, very bad sea conditions, a couple of landing craft were destroyed. Only approximately half of the Ranger force that was meant to land underneath Pont du Hoc actually arrived. They then had to go up this sheer cliff using ladders that they'd actually borrowed from the London Fire Brigade, which were not actually long enough. So they actually needed to grapple up the last few feet to get to the top. When they got there, the guns were not there, but after a scouting party found 5 of the 6 guns and they were able to put them out of action. They then had a series of counteroffensive by the German forces, which they had to withhold over the course of 2 days. It wasn't until the morning of the 8th of June that they were finally relieved by other Rangers battalions. And so for 2 days, they were in a quite small emplacement at the top of Pont du Hoc, an amazing achievement by the US Rangers.
Wow. I mean, just hearing you tell it, I can imagine myself being there and seeing the site as it is today. But what an incredible and harrowing experience that must have been for the folks that were there back in 1944. With
that's
that,
what you see. Also, what you see at the top is the memorial to the Rangers. So
great.
You will have time. Obviously, people would have a bit of time to walk around and see the scarred landscape, but also to visit the Ranger Memorial.
Great. And with that, I want to ask you about another site that we visit, which is Arromanches. And this was one that I was not as familiar with in preparing for this webinar. And I was wondering if you could tell me about this place and why we visit it on our tours.
Arromanches is actually an example of incredible engineering feat. The Allies in 1942, there had been the Dieppe raid. And this had shown the Allied command that they would not be able to gain a foothold in any French port. And obviously, with the amount of troops they needed to bring into France after D-Day, they would need some sort of artificial ports, artificial harbour. So they created two what are called Mulberry harbours, which were brought over by barge from southern England. Now, unfortunately, one of them, which was meant to be by Omaha Beach, extremely heavy storms on June the 19th, severely damaged, so it was unusable. But the remains that you can actually see in this picture of the Mulberry Harbour at Arromanches, which was actually on one of the British beaches at Gold Beach, was actually able to function for 10 months. And in fact, during that 10-month period, over 2.5 million men were landed, over 500,000 vehicles, and over 4 million tons of supplies were brought in for the Allied forces because of this Mulberry Harbour. So an amazing engineering feat.
Wow, that is something that I, had not been very much aware of. So certainly an incredible site to visit, and especially to witness those acts of engineering. I do want to transition now to a site that I think a lot of our travelers will be very interested in, which is the American Cemetery at Colville. And this is, looks like it would be a really incredible experience to be here. And I wonder if you could just tell us a bit about the cemetery and what it's like to go there with our travelers.
I would say that as moving as it is to visit Omaha Beach, this is the most moving part of the Normandy experience, visiting Colville. The cemetery itself, originally, actually as early as the 8th of June 1944, the US First Army actually created a temporary cemetery at Saint Laurent. And so this was then laid out on top of that original cemetery. It contains almost 9,400 graves, of which the last was actually buried on June the 19th of 2018. A man named Julius Piper was moved there to be next to his twin brother. And this was actually one of 45 pairs of brothers that are actually buried in the cemetery, probably most famously Theodore and Quentin Roosevelt, Theodore Jr. and Quentin Roosevelt, sons of the former President Teddy Roosevelt. Quentin had actually died in the First World War and was moved to Colville to be next to his brother Theodore in 1955. Theodore himself is a very interesting character because he was the oldest man to have landed on D-Day at 56 years old. He was the highest ranking officer, he was a general, and he was the only father and son that landed on D-Day, because his son landed at Omaha, he landed at Utah. And so they're buried next to each other there. The other very famous brothers to mention are then the Nyland brothers. Two of the Nyland brothers are buried in the cemetery, and they were the inspiration for the movie Saving Private Ryan.
Yes.
The cemetery, which overlooks Omaha Beach, and here we can see the famous statue, the bronze statue, the spirit of American youth rising from the waves, is a vast area of 172.5 acres in the form of a Latin cross. There is in the semicircular, you can see this part of the memorial, which contains maps and information about the campaign. And you got the reflecting pool in front of it. It's a beautiful, beautiful cemetery, beautiful location. We do obviously on tours get people that want to visit specific graves in Colville. And obviously with such a large cemetery, we obviously will always allow time for that type of thing. There is actually a website that you can go to, findagrave.com, which will actually give you then the exact location, the row letter and the number, which makes it much easier rather than trying to scout through all these graves to actually find a specific grave that you're looking for. So it's very well organized. The cemetery is beautiful, is beautifully laid out, beautifully kept. and over 1 million visitors per year.
Wow.
It's the most visited of the American Battle Monuments Commission properties.
Wow. And my understanding is that it's maintained by the French government. Is that correct?
Yeah, the territory is not actually American territory. So it's not like going into an embassy and you're on American soil, but it was granted to the Americans by the French government in perpetuity.
Wow.
So it will remain an American military cemetery in perpetuity.
Well, David, I want to thank you so much for talking to us about the experience in Normandy, and so far we've very much focused on the way that we build these tours for our American visitors, but we also do have some Canadian specific history tours, and I was hoping you could very briefly touch on Juno Beach and the experience that folks might have there if they're on one of our Canadian history tours.
Absolutely. Now, obviously, we will. When we go to Juno Beach, our travelers will have time to walk along the beach. There are a series of memorials outside the Juno Beach Centre. But this is the beach where the Canadian forces landed. It was actually the 3rd Infantry Division and the 2nd Armoured Brigade. Behind what we're looking at now is actually a very impressive museum, which we will have entrance to on the tours. We can see the Juno Beach Centre, which is built as a homage to the 45,000 Canadians that died during the Second World War, of which 5,500 actually died in this area during the Battle of Normandy. And in fact, actually 359 died on D-Day itself. So it's actually obviously a Canadian specific museum, very, very interesting. We have time to visit the museum, time to walk on the beach, to see the monuments that you can see part of in the picture there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, David. I really appreciate hearing from you about the experience of our Normandy tours, but also getting a bit of your expertise in the history. And frankly, I learned something in the process of this, so I appreciate that. Stay tight. We're gonna call you back for some question and answer at the end. But for now, I'm gonna transition over to our other tour director, Ione. Ione, how are you today?
I'm fine, thank you.
Great.
Very
Well,
happy to be here.
we're happy to have you. What we're going to be talking about with you is largely having to do with Vimy Ridge. So, as many of our travelers will know, Vimy Ridge was a very important battle in World War I history, and in particular, Canadian history. And you were lucky enough to participate in the commemoration of the 100th anniversary of that battle. And we also do have a special events tour next year that will be commemorating the 105th anniversary. So, Ione, if you could tell us about what it was like to be there for that that commemoration, but also why is this battle so important to history?
It was a great opportunity for me to lead a tour for the Vimy 100th anniversary. I had a fantastic group of Canadians. We as tour directors had a special training for that tour. Go Ahead brought us earlier, months before the event, on site to show us the logistic, as well as to teach us about the significance of this site. When I visited the trenches for the first time, I realized it was the first time I was experiencing something like that. I felt like the whole concept of war had become a lot closer to me that day. I could really imagine the smell of it, the cold, the isolation, the desperation of the soldiers and the life in the trenches. The day of the ceremony, the 9th of April, 2017, we were there at the Canadian National Vimy Memorial, and I was there with my group and other 5,000 Canadians. It was a very warm day. I wasn't expecting the weather to be so nice. And all of a sudden, all these readings I had done before the tour came back to my mind, and recalling the stories of that battle. So all of a sudden, I tried to portray in my mind that 100 years earlier, in that same place, which back then was not as pleasant as it was in that day. It was like a cold and rainy, muddy, bloody battlefield, where 30,000 Canadian soldiers were gathered in trenches ready for the assault to kick off. The First World War has transformed Canada from a colony of the British Empire into a nation, at the cost of nearly 250,000 casualties. The memorial that you can see, the site, is a tribute to the 66,000 Canadian soldiers who gave their lives for freedom and peace in World War I. The memorial, it's astonishing. It rests on a bed of 11,000 tons of concrete with 100 tons of steel, and the sorrowing female figures that you see in the middle that represents Canada as a young nation mourning her death. The memorial stands on Hill 145, which was the highest point of the ridge, which was captured by all 4 divisions of Canadian Corps, fighting together for the first time in Canadian history. Out of 10,600 casualties, 3,600 Canadians gave their lives between the 9th and the 12th of April 1917, when finally the ridge was conquered. And the names of the 12,000 Canadian soldiers who were killed in France in World War I are carved on the walls of the monument.
Mm. Now, Ione, go on.
Yes, sorry.
Oh,
Please.
I was going to ask you, you were talking a bit about just what the experience was like for these soldiers being in these trenches and how difficult those conditions were. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that experience, but also the way in which the trenches have been preserved for folks to visit and experience for themselves as well.
Yes, close to the memorial, it is possible to visit the trenches. The visitors today, they have the opportunity to feel how the life in the trenches was like. They can walk through the same trenches the troops did back in 1917. At Vimy Ridge, Canadian trenches at some points were really close to German trenches. In certain areas, it was literally a stone's distance across the crater between the front lines. The life in the trenches was obviously miserable, terrifying. Diseases as trench foot, moments of terror, living constantly under terror, spending days and days outside, no matter what the conditions were like. It is very interesting also to visit the dugouts at Vimy, where you can see in the graffitis, you can see the maple leaf as a symbol Canadians were identifying with. The experience of the trenches so far with all the tours that I have led there was certainly one of the most powerful for the groups.
Sure. I can only imagine.
Claustrophobic dimension,
Yes. Yeah. Oh, and you've been talking about the conditions there. You see the way it looks now, and it looks rather pleasant and serene, but one can only imagine the the conditions as they were back then. Another battle that we do visit sites related to, and I was hoping you could talk about this, is the Battle of the Somme. And in particular, we visit a memorial, Beaumont Hamel, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on that and talk about why that's an important site for Newfoundlanders.
Yeah, the Battle of the Somme has been recalled as the deadliest battle in human history, really. It lasted 4 months, from July the 1st to November the 18th, 1916. It took place on both sides, the upper reaches of the Somme, which is a river in France. More than 3 million men fought in the battle, and 1 million men were wounded or killed. So the battle is as synonymous of the horrors of the First World War. The Germans, who had also suffered greatly in the fighting, called it Das Blutbad, the bloodbath. More than 24,000 Canadians soldiers were killed in the battle or went missing during the Battle of the Somme. The Beaumont Hamel Memorial is dedicated to the 700 soldiers from Newfoundland that lost their lives during the offensive. The offensive took place on the morning of July the 1st, 1916, at 6 a.m., when the Allied forces bombarded the Germans for about an hour. At 7:20 a.m., 10 minutes before 0 hour, the Allied detonated more than 18,000 kilograms of explosives, turning the area into a giant crater. The timing was actually a terrible mistake, because the explosion alerted the Germans that a land attack was imminent, while the 10 minutes delay gave them the time to strengthen their defense and get ready with the machine guns. So as the first wave of the Allied troops went into the trenches, they were greeted by a devastating barrage of enemy artillery and machine gun fire. Most of the men were killed in minutes. Imagine that of the 800 Newfoundlanders who fought in the battle, the day after, only 68 of them were able to answer the call.
That's
the memorial,
incredible.
more 700 soldiers were killed in this battle. So the site is particularly touching. There is this beautiful monument of a great bronze caribou, which was the emblem of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment. And the caribou stands on the highest point overlooking the former battlefield. At the base of the statue, there are 3 bronze tablets with the names of the more than 800 Newfoundlanders who died in the war and have no known grave. It is the largest, the Beaumont Memorial, it is the largest memorial of the 5 memorials for Newfoundlanders that form altogether the Trail of the Caribou.
Ah, the Trail of the Caribou.
Yeah.
I see. Wonderful. Well, I that is a really incredible monument there, and I'm sure will be of interest to all of our travelers that go there. There's 2 sites that I wanted to ask you about in the city of Ypres, and one of them is the in Flanders Field Museum, and the second is Menin Gate. So if you could tell me about those 2 things, I would really appreciate it.
The museum in Flanders Field, it gives you a great introduction to World War I history through a multi-sensory experience that combines soundscapes, videos, exhibits, and interactive learning stations. It is part of a beautiful building called Lakenhalle on the main square of the city, which is called Grote Markt. And it is named after probably one of the most famous poem in Canadian literature, in Flanders Field, a poem written by John McCrae during the Second Battle of Ypres. In Flanders Field, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, which has become one of the rallying cry for people on the home front during the war. Close by, just a few steps away, there is the Manning Gate. The Manning Gate is a huge stone gateway inscribed with the names of 55,000 British and Commonwealth troops whose bodies were never found. The memorial was opened in 1927 as the citizens of Ypres wanted to express their gratitude for the men who had given their life for the liberation of Belgium. And since, this is the most incredible thing, since the 1928, so almost really 100 years, every evening at 8 p.m. in that site, buglers from the Last Post Association, they close the road, which passes under the memorial, and they sound the last post every evening.
What an incredible tribute. And our travelers will be able to go and see that ceremony take place?
Yes, absolutely.
Wonderful.
You need to go there a little earlier because it can be very crowded. There's always, every night, no matter when, all year long, there's always many people attending the ceremony.
Of course. The last site that I wanted to ask you about is Tyne Cot Cemetery. Can you tell me a little bit about this cemetery and why it's important and why we go to visit there?
The cemetery is important, as you see in the picture. The cemetery is the world's biggest British Commonwealth War cemetery. So there is almost 12,000 graves. And there is also this memorial, like a huge semicircular walls that commemorates another 35,000 soldiers whose names wouldn't fit on the main gate.
Oh my goodness.
And it is a silent witness. The memorial is intended as a silent witness to the bloody Battle of Passchendaele, which is also known as the Third Battle of Ypres.
Wow, that is really incredible. Thank you again for joining us today and also sharing your expertise about these sites. Again, if you do have questions for Ione, please submit them to us if you're on Facebook in the comments section, or if you're on Zoom, you can submit them to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We're going to have her and David back in just a moment for question and answer. Before we do that, though, I'm going to talk about a few itineraries that we have available that do focus on World War history. And I'm also going to talk to Kevin briefly about customization options. So the first itinerary that we want to mention to you is one of our most popular, and it's called American World War II History, London to Berlin. This tour is really incredible. You go from London to Berlin with the opportunity to add a stay in Munich. In London, of course, you'll be able to visit the Churchill War Rooms, and then you cross the English Channel to experience Normandy as David described to us. Then you'll visit Paris, Luxembourg, and you will have experiences related to the Battle of the Bulge near Bastogne, and then continue on to Berlin. The next tour that we have, and this is one that we mentioned before is a special event tour. So this is the Vimy Ridge 105th anniversary Amsterdam to Paris. On this tour, you'll begin in Amsterdam, and travel through the Netherlands and Belgium, and then to France. And on this tour, of course, you not only will be visiting the Vimy battlefields, but you'll also be experiencing some Canadian World War II history, as we mentioned, such as the beaches at Normandy. The last tour that we wanted to mention is Paris, Normandy, Brittany Coast, and the Loire Valley. Now, this tour we wanted to mention because it is one of our more classic tours, or as we call it, a standard tour that does include some of these historical elements. The Normandy coast is a prime example. So the reason we wanted to bring this one up is just to show you that even if you're on one of our standard tours, you can still find some of these historical elements worked in. However, if you're looking for a special event or a history specific tour, we also have that for you as well. And as we mentioned, you can always customize your tour. So Kevin, I'm going to bring you back here to talk about customization. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the process is for customizing a tour? And if you could use one or two examples of some things that we've built into tours for folks that have customized their experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a team of 4 customized tour specialists, and really their job is to take ideas from a group leader or group coordinator and turn that into a tour experience. So as I mentioned before, you only need 7 or more travelers to customize a trip with Go Ahead. And we work with whoever's organizing that group to really take their ideas and turn them into an itinerary. For World War history tours, this really ranges from really in-depth, very specific and very customized experiences to just some smaller tweaks to what you would find on some of our classic tours. So for example, one of our group coordinators for a history tour actually teaches a adult learning course on World War history, specifically D-Day. And he has done a custom tour in Normandy where you spend an entire week in Normandy visiting all of the sites David mentioned, plus many, many more, down to GPS coordinates of a certain hill that the Allies took that really changed the course of a certain day in history. So that is a very in-depth tour focusing on D-Day. The other end of the spectrum, many travelers will just look at our Paris, Normandy, Brittany Coast, and the Loire Valley tour that you mentioned, and add something like a stop in Bayeux, which is a beautiful French town in Normandy, known for the Bayeux tapestry. So that just gives you an idea of the levels of customization. You can really, really customize your experience, or just make some minor tweaks to the tours that we have. Either way, our customized team can work with you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Kevin. And stay where you are. And we're going to also bring in David and Ione to talk about, to answer some questions that we've had submitted. Ione, one question that was submitted on Facebook by Chattel, she asks, how difficult is the walking? She says, I use a cane or a walking stick. What do you think about the difficulty of the walking on these tours?
No, I don't think it's difficult. The sites we made on these kind of tours were very often on the bus, and all the sites, the cemeteries, the memorials can be very easily accessed by bus. So there's not really much walking. I would say it is a regular go-ahead pace. Probably the only if we're talking about special events, the day of the commemoration, it can be trickier because if there's many people gathering together, then there's many more procedures and timings that we do not manage, but we have to compromise with. So maybe in that particular day, but normally, no.
Sure, sure. So no more difficult than a normal go-ahead tour,
No.
but if it's a special event, there could be some complicating factors there because there's less that we control. But what I would say is if you do have questions about the amount of walking on one of these tours, give one of our tour consultants a call and we can give you a real in-depth consultation about your specific needs and see if it would be a good fit. All right, let's give this question to David. David, are there any books or movies that you recommend that you think portray these battles well and that you would recommend that people watch or read before doing these tours? And this question's from Rick. So David, do you have any book or movie recommendations?
The first book that comes to mind is actually an overall book about the Second World War, which was written by an American journalist who had access to all of the German papers, which is the Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, William L. Shearer. That one, I think, is probably the greatest basic textbook about the Second World War, certainly about the Nazis. So I would definitely recommend that. It sounds cliched, but I would recommend watching Saving Private Ryan, because the first 20 minutes, I think, gives you an incredible perspective of what it was like to land on Omaha Beach. Obviously, there's a number of other war movies that are worth looking at, but that book and that movie would be the first two that come to my mind.
Great, wonderful. Thank you for that. And we did actually get a couple of different questions about recommended reading in movies. And so after these webinars, we do send out a follow-up email. So we'll include those recommendations in that email as well. So keep an eye on your inbox and we'll send some recommendations to you there as well. Let's see. This one is a question that I think either of you would be able to answer. And this one's from Linda. She's scheduled to go on the London, Normandy, and Paris tour next year. And she was wondering about if there's any recommendations that you would have for things to do outside of the scheduled tour. So free time recommendations for the London, Normandy, and Paris tour.
Regarding First and Second World War, or just general?
She doesn't specify, but let's go with history related.
History related. Well, certainly in London, we actually include the Imperial War Museum. Well, actually, no, that's on the regular London, Paris, Normandy. That wouldn't be included. So those two things that we do on the actual specialized tours of the Imperial War Museum, which is free, is fantastic, incredible exhibition about the Blitz. Also, then the Churchill War Rooms, which obviously you do have to book in advance, but that's actually very fascinating. Where basically from the British perspective, where the war was run from. So two things that actually included on our Second World War tour would be definitely something to do on a regular tour as well.
And what about recommendations that aren't history related?
Well, definitely the food in England. No, I'm joking. The food and wine in France.
Yeah.
That would be something. Obviously, maybe in London to go to a show. In Paris to go on a Seine cruise is always wonderful.
Great.
And then art galleries.
We got another question from Lois, which I will just answer here myself. So Lois asked, she said, we are booked on the Canadian World War History Tour. And she asked, how many cemeteries will we visit where there are Canadians buried? And looking at the itinerary, it appears that there will be 3 different cemetery visits. So you have 3 different cemetery visits on that itinerary. So that is a good answer to that question there. Another question that we had submitted before the tour, or before this began, was this question was, do you ever have special event tours for D-Day anniversaries? And Kevin, I'm going to ask that one of you.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, we did have some special event departures around the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landings, and we were able to attend the exclusive special events, as a part of EF. We haven't heard quite yet what France is actually planning in terms of an 80th anniversary, but assuming that they do put on some events, we'd like to be back for that next kind of larger anniversary. But we will also typically set dates for our history tours that coincide with many of these large historic dates, whether that is, Victory in Europe Day, the anniversary of the D-Day landings, Veterans Day. So we will typically schedule some things around those events as well.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. Ione, I'm going to ask this one of you. Have you ever led a tour that had family members of veterans on the tour, or was it just folks that were interested in the tour or interested in the itinerary more generally?
I would say 70% of the people that came on these tours had stories in their family, their grandparents or uncle, or things that were strictly related to their family history. And that was it was a gift for all of us, because that made the tour very personal. Just what Kevin was saying at the beginning, that created a very special atmosphere. I remember on the bus, we would all share stories, also personal stories, very emotional sometimes, but so real, so different. You see, I mean, I'm still in touch with many of the people who came on these tours. We still have these group emails where we exchange, articles and stories. It's a very, very strong connection, but
Wow.
painful.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow.
Somehow.
Well, thank you all for joining us out there, and thank you to David, Ione, and Kevin. I want to thank you again for joining us. Before we go, I do just want to tell you about some upcoming events that we have coming up soon. On Tuesday the 8th, we have a virtual escape, the Canadian Rockies Adventure. And then on Tuesday, June 15th, we're going to be doing a destination spotlight on Croatia and the Balkans. And then on June 29th, we're doing another destination spotlight on one of our most popular tours, London, Paris, and Rome. But thank you again, David. Thank you again, Ione. And thank you, Kevin, for joining us today. We really appreciated hearing your expertise and for helping us revisit these most important historical moments. So thank you to all who joined us, and thank you to our panelists. We'll see you again soon.
Thanks so much.
A pleasure.
Thank you.